On January 11, 1944, at 11:47 in the morning, Major James Howard found himself in an impossible position. Through his cockpit canopy, he watched over 30 Luftwaffe aircraft plummeting toward three bomber formations near Oschersleben, Germany. His P-51 Mustang squadron had vanished, scattered during a dogfight moments earlier, leaving him as the sole defender in the sky. Howard brought 3 decades of life experience and extensive combat credentials to this moment. His logbook showed 70 missions across 2 theaters of war. Flying with the legendary Flying Tigers over Burma and China, he'd claimed 6 Japanese aircraft in 56 sorties. Since December, he'd flown 14 additional missions over European skies after assuming command of the 356th Fighter Squadron, mastering the cutting-edge long-range P-51 Mustang. The enemy force descending on those bombers represented Germany's aerial elite. Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s and Focke-Wulf FW-190S, piloted by seasoned veterans operating from nearby bases, carried full combat loads of fuel and ammunition after launching from airfields less than 50 miles distant. Dawn had broken at 0700 hours when 50 P-51 Mustangs from the 354 Fighter Group lifted off to escort 3 divisions of B-17 Flying Fortresses. Their objective, aircraft manufacturing facilities at Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and nearby locations, installations vital to German fighter production situated 90 miles southwest of Berlin. The bombing runs had succeeded. Ordnance had been delivered, and the formations had pivoted homeward. That's when the Luftwaffe pounced. Howard's group intercepted a formation of twin-engine Bf-110 destroyers near the target zone. Howard successfully destroyed one, watching it plummet earthward, but the engagement fragmented his unit across the sky. When he climbed back to the bomber's cruising altitude of 24,000 feet, every other American fighter had disappeared from view below him. 300 airmen crewed those B-17s, 30 men per bomber, 10 aircraft holding tight defensive formation. Their survival through the 3-hour return flight to England depended entirely on fighter protection. The bomber crews had already witnessed their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts turning back 60 minutes earlier, those fighters lacking sufficient fuel capacity for deep penetration into German territory. Now the P-51s had vanished too, except Howard. His Mustang-mounted 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 per wing, fed by 1,700 rounds total. The inboard weapons held 350 rounds each. The outboard guns carried 280 apiece. With perfect trigger discipline and standard combat firing rates, he had roughly 4 minutes of sustained fire available. His fuel gauge indicated perhaps 30 minutes of combat endurance. Beyond that, he'd be gliding. The first German aircraft rolled into attack formation. Howard slammed his throttle to emergency war power and dove. His P-51B screamed past 400 miles per hour. He closed on a Bf-10-9 lining up behind a B-17 named Patches. Howard's gun sights centered on the Messerschmitt's cockpit. He squeezed the trigger for 3 seconds, 75 rounds down range. The canopy exploded. The German fighter inverted, trailing smoke and coolant as it tumbled away. Howard yanked back hard, a 6G turn that narrowed his peripheral vision. 2 more Bf-10-9s were already positioning for another pass. He reversed, cutting inside their turn radius. The Mustang's exceptional roll rate gave him the edge. He fired again, a 1-second burst. The trailing Messerschmitt's cowling erupted in flames. The pilot ejected immediately. But reinforcements appeared. Focke-Wulf 190S approached from the north. Yellow-nosed aircraft from an elite squadron. They identified Howard and recognized the threat. 1 American, alone. They could overwhelm him through coordinated assault. Would Howard's ammunition hold out? Please hit the like button. It helps this history reach more viewers. Subscribe to see what happened next. Back to Howard over Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots began their coordination. Some would engage Howard directly while others targeted the bombers. Standard tactics against outnumbered escorts. Howard saw it developing. He had seconds to decide. Defend himself in turning combat against experienced German pilots or stay with the bombers and accept attacks from multiple angles without wingman support. He chose the bombers. A Focke-Wulf dove at the lead B-17 formation from 12 o'clock high. Howard cut the angle and fired. The Focke-Wulf's wing root exploded. The aircraft snap-rolled left and disintegrated. But two more fighters were already attacking from opposite sides. Howard's ammunition counter dropped faster than his fuel gauge. He'd burned through 500 rounds in less than 4 minutes. The mathematics were brutal and simple. 30 German fighters, 1 American, 1,200 rounds remaining. The German pilots understood the mathematics too. They kept coming. Howard's airspeed indicator hit 430 miles per hour in a near-vertical dive. He pulled up into a climbing spiral. 3 Bf-10-9s followed. He reversed hard at the apex. They shot past his nose. He rolled inverted and pulled through, positioning behind the trailing Messerschmitt. He fired. Another 2-second burst. Another fighter fell. Then his gun camera recorded something catastrophic. 3 of his 4 guns had stopped firing. Only one Browning continued cycling. Howard checked his gun switches, toggling them off and back on. Nothing changed. Only his left inboard Browning was functioning. The other 3 had jammed, likely from sustained high-G maneuvers combined with the brutal temperatures at 24,000 feet, where the air dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Metal contracted, springs weakened, ammunition belts misaligned. Standard mechanical failures under extreme conditions. But Howard had no time for troubleshooting. 6 Bf-10-9s were reforming for another attack run on the bombers. He still had 1 gun. 350 rounds remained in that single weapon. Perhaps 90 seconds of firing time if he exercised extreme selectivity. The German fighters didn't know his guns had failed. That gave him leverage. As long as he maintained aggressive positioning, kept threatening shots, the Luftwaffe pilots would have to respect the danger. They'd have to defend themselves. That meant they couldn't focus exclusively on the bombers. A Focke-Wulf rolled into a high-side attack against the rearmost B-17. Howard turned hard into the threat, lined up his shot, waited until 400 yards, then fired a 1-second burst, 25 rounds. The Focke-Wulf broke off and dove away. Howard didn't know if he'd scored hits. It didn't matter. The bomber was safe for another 30 seconds. 2 more Bf-10-9s came at the formation from opposite sides. A classic pincer attack. Howard couldn't engage both simultaneously. He chose the closer threat and turned toward it. The Messerschmitt pilot saw Howard coming and broke away early. The second Bf-109 pressed its attack but had to brake hard when Howard reversed toward it. Neither fighter achieved a clean shot at the bombers. Howard was purchasing time with aggressive positioning, using his last gun sparingly, making every round count. Inside the B-17s, gunners watched through their plexiglass blisters as the lone Mustang fought off attack after attack. They could see German fighters everywhere, could see the P-51 diving and climbing and reversing between the enemy aircraft and their formation. Some bomber crews would later report counting 40 German fighters in the area. Others estimated 30. All agreed they'd never witnessed anything comparable. One American fighter staying with them through sustained combat when he could have easily disengaged and headed home. Howard's fuel gauge dropped into the yellow zone. He'd been fighting for 17 minutes. His tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. 30 German fighters remained in the area. His ammunition counter showed 200 rounds left. 1 gun, fuel for perhaps 13 more minutes of combat. The mathematics hadn't improved. They'd worsened. 3 Bf-10-9s formed up in tight Vic formation and came straight at the lead B-17. Howard dove to intercept, positioning perfectly. The Germans saw him coming and broke early. Too early. They were respecting his firepower. His bluff was working. But how long could he maintain the deception? How long before the German pilots realized he was barely shooting? A Focke-Wulf made a beam attack from the right. Howard turned hard into it, pulling 7 Gs. His vision tunneled. He centered the gun sight and fired 1 second. The Focke-Wulf's canopy shattered. The fighter peeled away. Howard had scored a solid hit, but that burst cost him another 25 rounds. 175 remained, less than 5 seconds of ammunition. The Luftwaffe pilots were adjusting their tactics. They'd recognized Howard was alone and running low on ammunition based on how selectively he was shooting. 2 Bf-10-9s began stalking him, staying on his tail, forcing defensive maneuvering instead of intercepting attacks on the bombers.
If they could pin him in a defensive spiral, the other German fighters could savage the B-17 formation unopposed. Howard reversed hard. The pursuing Bf-109S overshot. He pointed his nose at the leader and fired. Nothing happened. His last gun had jammed. He was completely out of ammunition. Howard's finger remained on the trigger, but no rounds fired. His last functioning gun had quit. The ammunition counter showed 175 rounds remaining, but the weapon wouldn't cycle. The charging mechanism had frozen solid, or the belt had twisted, or the barrel had overheated despite the sub-zero temperatures. Whatever the cause, the result was identical. He was flying a fighter with no working guns over Germany, with 30 Luftwaffe aircraft still hunting his bombers. The two Bf-10-9s behind him didn't know his weapons had failed. They broke off their pursuit when Howard pointed his nose at them. That gave him an idea the Luftwaffe pilots couldn't see inside his cockpit, couldn't see his guns weren't firing. They only knew the American Mustang had been shooting accurately for the past 20 minutes. They had to assume he still had ammunition. Howard could exploit that assumption. He could bluff. A Focke-Wulf positioned for an attack on the left side B-17, Howard turned hard toward it, closed the range to 300 yards, pointed his nose directly at the German fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot saw Howard coming and broke off his attack immediately, diving away. Howard didn't fire because he couldn't fire, but the German pilot didn't know that. The threat alone had been sufficient. Howard repeated the tactic. Every time a German fighter positioned for an attack run, he turned toward it, closed aggressively, pointed his nose. The Luftwaffe pilots broke off, some dove, some turned away. None pressed their attacks when they saw the Mustang coming at them. Howard was defending 300 bomber crewmen with nothing but aggressive maneuvering and the reputation of his earlier gunnery. But the tactic was burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. Each intercept required hard turns. Each hard turn required full throttle. Each minute of combat consumed fuel he needed for the 3-hour flight back to England. His gauge showed 8 minutes of combat endurance remaining. After that, his options narrowed to bailing out over Germany or attempting to glide to Allied lines, neither survivable at this distance from friendly territory. The German pilots were starting to recognize something was wrong. Howard was pointing his nose at them but not firing. 3 Bf-10-9s formed up and came at the bombers simultaneously from different angles. Howard turned toward the closest threat. The Messerschmitt broke away, but the other two pressed their attacks. Howard couldn't intercept both. One Bf-109 got within firing range of a B-17 named Lucky Lady. The bomber's waist gunners opened fire, 50 caliber tracers arcing across the sky. The Messerschmitt's attack was wild and inaccurate. The fighter broke away without scoring hits. Howard's fuel gauge dropped into the red zone, 6 minutes of combat fuel remaining. The B-17 formation was still 90 miles from the German border, still 170 miles from the safety of Allied fighter coverage over Belgium. The Luftwaffe had time. They had fuel. They had ammunition. They could wait for Howard to run dry and then destroy the bombers at leisure. A Focke-Wulf made another run. Howard intercepted, pointing his nose. The German broke away, but this time the Focke-Wulf pilot didn't dive far. He pulled back up after 1,000 feet and repositioned. He was testing, probing, trying to determine if Howard was actually shooting or just bluffing. 2 more Bf-10-9s coordinated their approach, both coming at the bombers from different quadrants. Howard turned toward one. It broke away. He reversed toward the second. That pilot held his attack longer, much longer, closing to within 300 yards of a B-17's tail before finally breaking hard left. The German was getting bolder. Howard's bluff was losing effectiveness. Inside the B-17 cockpits, pilots were watching their fuel gauges, too. They'd been flying for 4 hours. Their range was being consumed, but they couldn't increase speed without breaking formation, couldn't break formation without losing their defensive firepower. They had to maintain course and speed and trust that the lone Mustang pilot would keep the Luftwaffe at bay. Howard checked his position. The bomber formation was 70 miles from the German border now, 20 minutes of flying time, but his fuel gauge showed only 4 minutes of combat endurance left. The mathematics had finally caught up with him. Howard made a decision. He would stay with the bombers until his fuel forced him to leave, or until German fighters shot him down. Those were the only two outcomes now. Running for home while the B-17s were still under attack wasn't an option he considered. 300 men depended on his presence, even if his guns didn't work, even if his fuel was nearly gone. The psychological effect of having fighter escort was keeping some German pilots cautious. That was worth something. A Bf-109 dove from above, Howard turned into it hard, pulling the Mustang's nose up at a 70-degree angle. The Messerschmitt pilot saw Howard coming and rolled away without firing another intercept. Another German fighter deterred, but Howard's airspeed bled off dangerously low in the climb. His indicated airspeed dropped below 200 miles per hour. The Mustang shuddered, nearly stalled. He pushed the nose down to regain speed. That maneuver cost him altitude and fuel. The Luftwaffe pilots were definitely probing now, testing Howard's responses. A Focke-Wulf made a feint at the bombers from the right. Howard turned toward it. The Focke-Wulf broke away immediately, but while Howard was turning right, two Bf-10-9s attacked from the left. They were coordinating, using decoys, splitting Howard's attention. He reversed hard left. The two Messerschmitts broke off their attacks, but they'd gotten closer than before. Much closer. One had closed to within 200 yards of a B-17's tail. Howard's fuel gauge showed 3 minutes remaining. His tactical situation was impossible. 30 German fighters still in the area, no ammunition, almost no fuel, 70 miles from the German border. But the B-17 crews were watching him, depending on him. He kept fighting. Two Focke-Wulfs came at the formation simultaneously. Howard turned toward the lead fighter, pointing his nose aggressively. The German held his course longer this time, testing. Howard held his course too. Neither fired. Neither broke. They closed to less than 300 yards before both fighters turned away simultaneously. The Focke-Wulf pilot had called Howard's bluff, but still hadn't committed fully to the attack. Still wasn't certain the American Mustang was actually out of ammunition.
A Bf-109 attacked from below. Classic underbelly approach where bomber gunners had limited fields of fire. Howard rolled inverted and pulled through, diving at the Messerschmitt. The German broke hard right and dove away. Howard pulled back up to the bomber's altitude. That defensive maneuver had cost him precious fuel. His gauge showed 2 minutes of combat endurance, maybe less. The bomber formation crossed over a small German town. Howard could see the terrain below clearly. Snow-covered fields, dark forests, roads, railways, all enemy territory. If his fuel ran out now, he'd have to bail out, become a prisoner of war, spend the rest of the conflict in a German Stalag. Assuming the German civilians below didn't find him first, downed Allied airmen weren't always treated well by civilians whose cities had been bombed. 3 Bf-10-9s positioned for a coordinated attack, one high, one level, one low, all attacking the same B-17 from different angles. Howard couldn't intercept all three. He chose the high threat, turning hard into it. The Messerschmitt broke away, but the other two pressed their attacks. The level fighter closed to within 150 yards of a B-17 named Texas Rose before breaking off. The low fighter got even closer and fired a burst. Tracers arced across the sky. Most missed, but some didn't. Howard saw bullet strikes spark along the B-17's right wing. The bomber stayed in formation, didn't fall out, didn't catch fire, but it had been hit. The Luftwaffe pilots had drawn blood. They'd proven they could damage the bombers despite Howard's presence. That would embolden them, make them more aggressive. Howard's bluff was failing. His fuel gauge dropped below 2 minutes. The bomber formation was still 60 miles from the German border, still 15 minutes of flying time. Howard's fuel would run out long before they reached safety. The Luftwaffe pilots knew it too. They began positioning for another mass attack. 6 German fighters formed up in 2 Vicks of 3 aircraft each. Textbook formation attack. They would come at the bombers from opposite sides simultaneously, forcing Howard to choose which threat to intercept. Whichever side he didn't defend would have free shots at the B-17s. Howard watched them positioning, calculated the geometry, realized he couldn't stop both groups, but he could try to disrupt their timing. He turned toward the first Vic of Bf-109s, accelerating toward them aggressively. The German formation held course. They weren't breaking this time. They'd committed to the attack. Howard kept his nose pointed at the lead Messerschmitt. Closing. 400 yards, 300, 250. The Germans still weren't breaking. Howard's finger twitched on his useless trigger. At 200 yards, the German formation finally scattered, split apart. The coordinated attack fell apart, but the second Vic was already diving on the bombers from the opposite side. Howard reversed hard, 7G turn. His vision grayed at the edges, blood drained from his head. He fought through it, got his nose pointed at the second formation, but he was too far away, too slow to intercept. 3 Focke-Wulfs dove at a B-17 from 12 o'clock high. The bomber's top turret gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed upward. The German fighters pressed through the defensive fire. All 3 opened fire simultaneously. 50 caliber rounds from the B-17 met 20-millimeter cannon shells from the Focke-Wulfs in the air between them. 1 Focke-Wulf took hits. Smoke poured from its engine. The fighter rolled left and dropped away. But the other 2 Focke-Wulfs scored hits on the B-17. Howard saw cannon strikes walk across the bomber's fuselage. The B-17's number 3 engine began trailing black smoke. The propeller continued spinning. The bomber stayed in formation, but it had been damaged, seriously damaged. Howard's fuel gauge showed 90 seconds of combat endurance remaining. His mind calculated the options. He could stay until his engine quit, try to glide toward friendly lines, hope to make it far enough to bail out over Belgium instead of Germany, or he could turn for home now while he still had fuel for the flight back to England. Save himself, leave the bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone for the final 50 miles to the German border. He stayed. The mathematics didn't matter anymore. The fuel didn't matter. Howard committed to staying with those B-17s until his Mustang fell out of the sky. That decision simplified everything. No more calculating fuel consumption. No more planning his exit. He would fight until his aircraft quit flying. 4 Bf-10-9s attacked from below, belly attacks where the bomber's defensive firepower was weakest. Howard rolled inverted and dove at them. The Messerschmitts scattered. 2 broke left, 2 broke right. Howard pulled through and climbed back to the bomber's altitude. His fuel gauge showed 60 seconds remaining. His engine was running on fumes and willpower. The damaged B-17 with the smoking engine began falling behind the formation, losing airspeed, dropping altitude, becoming an isolated target. The Luftwaffe pilots saw it immediately, saw the wounded bomber separating from the protection of the formation's massed defensive fire. 3 Focke-Wulfs turned toward it like sharks, sensing blood. Howard turned with them, positioning between the German fighters and the damaged bomber. The Focke-Wulfs came in fast. Howard turned toward the leader. The German held his course, didn't break, kept coming. Howard held his course too. They were playing chicken at 400 miles per hour, closure rate 800 miles per hour. 6 seconds to collision, 5 seconds, 4. At 3 seconds, the Focke-Wulf broke hard right and dove away. Howard had won the game of nerve, but the other 2 Focke-Wulfs used the distraction to attack the damaged bomber from opposite sides. Howard reversed toward them. Too late. Both German fighters fired. Both scored hits. The B-17's number 3 engine burst into flames. The crew shut it down, feathered the propeller. The bomber dropped further behind the formation. Howard positioned himself between the damaged aircraft and the circling Luftwaffe fighters. His fuel gauge showed 30 seconds remaining. His engine would quit any moment now. Howard's engine coughed, skipped a beat. His fuel pressure gauge flickered. The Packard Merlin 51650 was sucking vapor from nearly empty tanks. He had seconds before the engine quit completely. The damaged B-17 was 2 miles behind the main formation now, losing altitude steadily. 3 engines couldn't maintain level flight at this weight and altitude. The bomber crew was lightening the aircraft. Howard could see objects falling from the bomb bay, ammunition boxes, equipment, anything heavy that wasn't essential. They were fighting for altitude, fighting to stay airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. 5 Bf-10-9s circled the wounded bomber like wolves around injured prey. They recognized the kill opportunity. A B-17 separated from formation protection, down 1 engine, losing altitude, slow, vulnerable, an easy target. The Messerschmitts positioned for a coordinated attack. Howard turned to intercept. His engine coughed again, ran smooth for 3 seconds, coughed twice more. The fuel was gone. He was flying on residual fuel in the lines and carburetor. The first Bf-109 dove at the damaged bomber. Howard turned hard into the attack, pointed his nose at the Messerschmitt. The German pilot broke away. Second intercept, Howard's engine ran rough, misfired, caught again, kept running. A second Bf-109 attacked from the opposite side. Howard reversed. His Mustang's roll rate saved him. He got his nose around fast enough to threaten the attacker. The German broke off, but 3 more Messerschmitts were positioning. They had recognized Howard's engine was failing, could hear it running rough from half a mile away, could see his airspeed dropping as his power output decreased. They knew his combat effectiveness was finished. They pressed their attacks more aggressively, held their approach courses longer before breaking away, testing how much fight Howard had left. Howard's altimeter showed he was losing altitude too. His rough-running engine wasn't producing enough power to maintain level flight. He was descending slowly, 200 feet per minute. If his engine quit completely, he'd be in a glide. 4 minutes maximum until he'd be forced to bail out or attempt a crash landing in enemy territory. The main B-17 formation was now 5 miles ahead, still on course for the German border, still 45 miles from safety. The damaged bomber behind Howard was losing altitude faster now, down to 21,000 feet. The crew had jettisoned everything they could. The aircraft was as light as possible, but 3 engines weren't enough. They needed a miracle, or they needed fighter escort. Howard was trying to provide the escort, but his Mustang was dying. 2 Bf-10-9s attacked simultaneously from opposite beam angles. Classic pincer Howard turned toward one. His engine quit completely. Dead silence, except for wind noise. The Messerschmitt pilot saw Howard's propeller stop spinning, saw the engine was finished. The German pressed his attack, closing, 300 yards, 200. Lined up his shot on the B-17. Howard's Mustang was a glider now. No power, no thrust, just momentum and altitude. He nosed down to maintain airspeed, turned toward the attacking Bf-109, pointed his dead aircraft at the German fighter. The Messerschmitt pilot hesitated, broke away. Even with a dead engine, Howard was still threatening, still positioning aggressively. The bluff was working even in a powerless glider. But Howard's altitude was bleeding away fast. He descended through 20,000 feet, 19,000, 18,000. His airspeed was dropping too. Without power, he couldn't maintain combat speeds, couldn't turn as hard, couldn't intercept as effectively. The Luftwaffe pilots recognized his weakness. 4 Bf-109s formed up for a final mass attack on the damaged bomber. Howard turned toward them. His Mustang was barely responding now. Low airspeed, low altitude, no power. He was gliding into an attack against 4 German fighters who knew he was finished. The mathematics had finally caught up. 30 minutes of combat, 0 ammunition, 0 fuel, 1 powerless Mustang against 4 fully armed enemy fighters. Then Howard saw something on the horizon to the west. Small dots, aircraft approaching fast. The dots resolved into P-47 Thunderbolts, 8 of them fresh from forward bases in Belgium. They'd been scrambled to provide relief escort for the returning bomber formations. The Thunderbolts were still climbing, still 5 minutes away, but their presence changed everything. The Luftwaffe pilots saw them too, saw 8 fresh American fighters with full ammunition and fuel closing fast. The mathematics had reversed. The 4 Bf-10-9s positioning to attack the damaged bomber broke off, turned east, headed back toward their bases in Germany. The other Luftwaffe fighters scattered across the sky did the same. Within 90 seconds, the German fighters were gone, disappeared into the clouds and haze. The 30-minute battle was over. Howard's B-17s were safe, but Howard wasn't safe. His Mustang was gliding through 17,000 feet with no power. He was descending at 800 feet per minute. His airspeed showed 190 miles per hour and dropping. He needed to restart his engine or find a place to land. German territory stretched below him for another 40 miles. Beyond that was Belgium, then Allied lines, then England. Howard checked his fuel gauges again. Both tanks showed empty, completely dry. But aircraft fuel systems had residual fuel in the lines, in the carburetor. Sometimes enough to restart an engine for a few seconds, maybe a minute if the pilot was lucky. Howard reached for his fuel selector, switched from main tanks to reserve, turned his fuel boost pump to emergency high, hit his starter. The propeller turned once, twice. The engine caught, fired, ran rough for 3 seconds, then quit again. Not enough fuel. Howard tried again. Switched tanks, pumped the throttle, hit the starter. The engine caught again, ran for 5 seconds this time, coughed, died. But those 5 seconds of power had arrested his descent, bought him altitude, given him options. The lead P-47 pilot called Howard on the radio, asked for his status. Howard keyed his microphone, reported his fuel situation, explained he was attempting to glide to friendly territory. The Thunderbolt leader acknowledged, positioned his flight to escort Howard west. 2 P-47s stayed with the damaged B-17. The other 6 formed up around Howard's gliding Mustang. Howard descended through 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. Below him he could see the Belgian border, rivers, roads, small towns. He was gliding at a ratio of approximately 10 feet forward for every foot of altitude lost. From 10,000 feet, he could glide roughly 19 miles. The Belgian border was 22 miles ahead. He was going to fall short, land in Germany. Unless he could coax more power from his dying engine, he tried again. Fuel selector to auxiliary tank. Boost pump to high. Mixture rich. Throttle cracked open slightly. Starter engaged. The engine turned caught, fired, ran rough but stayed running. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 1 minute. The engine was pulling fuel from somewhere, maybe condensation in the tanks, maybe residual vapors. Whatever the source, Howard had power, limited power, intermittent power, but enough to shallow his descent. He leveled off at 8,000 feet. His engine coughed, ran smooth, coughed again, kept running. The Belgian border passed beneath his wings. He was over friendly territory now. Allied air bases were scattered across Belgium. He could reach one, probably, if his engine kept running for another 10 minutes. The damaged B-17 was descending too. The crew had shut down a second engine. Number 4 was overheating, running rough. They'd shut it down to prevent fire. The bomber was flying on 2 engines now, unable to maintain altitude, descending steadily toward Belgium. The crew would have to crash land or bail out. They wouldn't make it back to England. Howard's engine quit again. This time it wouldn't restart. He was gliding through 7,000 feet over Belgium, Allied territory, safe from German fighters, but still 40 miles from the nearest suitable airfield. He needed more altitude, or he'd be landing in a Belgian farmer's field. His instruments showed his glide ratio deteriorating, airspeed dropping, rate of descent increasing. Below him, he saw an Allied airstrip, small, probably a forward fighter base. Single runway, emergency landing field. It was 15 miles ahead. He was at 6,000 feet. The math was close, very close. Howard descended through 5,000 feet. The airfield ahead was 12 miles away. His glide path intersected the runway approach at approximately 1,000 feet. He'd have one chance. No engine meant no go-around. No second attempt he'd land on the first pass or crash short of the runway. The mathematics were absolute. He trimmed his Mustang for best glide speed, 175 miles per hour. Lowered his landing gear at 3,000 feet. The gear doors opened, the wheels extended, locked down. The additional drag steepened his descent angle. He compensated by nosing down slightly, maintained his glide speed. 4,000 feet, 3,000, 2,000. The runway was directly ahead. 3 miles, 2 miles. At 1,000 feet, Howard crossed the airfield boundary. His altitude was perfect. His approach angle was good. He crossed the runway threshold at 70 feet, 50, 30, flared. The main wheels touched first, then the tail wheel. The Mustang rolled straight down the center line, slowed, stopped. Howard had landed safely at a forward Belgian fighter base designated a 70 near Antwerp ground crew, swarmed his aircraft immediately, found his fuel tanks bone dry, found 3 of his 4 guns jammed solid, found his ammunition counter showing 175 rounds remaining in his one functioning gun, the gun that had quit firing. Howard climbed out, reported to the base operations officer, explained he'd been escorting B-17s over Oschersleben, explained he'd engaged enemy fighters. The operations officer arranged fuel and transport back to RAF Boxted in England. The bomber crews returned to their bases throughout the afternoon. All the B-17 from the 401st Bomb Group made it back. The damaged aircraft, with 2 engines shut down, crash-landed at an emergency field in Belgium. The crew survived. 0 fatalities. At the mission debriefing, 16 B-17 pilots reported witnessing the lone Mustang pilot defending their formations for more than 30 minutes against overwhelming enemy numbers. Some crews estimated he'd shot down 6 German fighters. Others reported 4. The bomber group commander, Colonel Harold Bowman, filed an immediate recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The story reached Stars and Stripes reporter Andy Rooney within 24 hours. Rooney interviewed Howard, interviewed the bomber crews, called it the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II. The article went international. Major James Howard became famous overnight. The Saturday Evening Post ran a feature titled One Man Air Force. Popular Science published Fighting at 400 miles per hour. True magazine called him the Mustang Whip. Official records credited Howard with 3 confirmed kills on January 11th, 2 Bf-110 and 1 Focke-Wulf 190, probable kills on 2 more, damaged aircraft uncounted, but the statistics missed the point. Howard had defended 300 bomber crewmen for 30 minutes without ammunition, without fuel, against 30 German fighters. The bomber crews knew what that meant. They knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. On June 5, 1944, Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz presented Major James Howard with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in England. Howard was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the decoration during World War II. His citation noted, "Conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty, single-handed attack against more than 30 enemy aircraft, continued fighting after ammunition exhausted, defended bomber formation until relief arrived." Howard continued flying combat missions through November 1944. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, then to colonel. After the war, he rose to brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He commanded bomb wings, directed airports, ran businesses, wrote his autobiography, Roar of the Tiger, in 1991. He died on March 18, 1995, at age 81, buried at Arlington National Cemetery. If James Howard's story moved you, please hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. We bring you real World War II history every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, wherever you are. Our community stretches across the entire world, and you're part of keeping these memories alive. Let us know your location and whether any of your family served in World War II. Thank you for watching. James Howard and the 300 bomber crewmen he defended over Germany deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.